In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to set up our development environment to write code that uses the Hibernate framework. So the first thing that we need to do is to download the binaries of the Hibernate distribution. This will provide us the jar files which are required in order to write code and use the framework. So we need to download the jar files and add them into our class path. To download the jar files, head over to hibernate.org/downloads. You will have a link for the release bundles. Download the latest release bundle that you see here. Right now it's 3.6.4 final. I'll be downloading the zip file. Okay, I've downloaded and extracted this Hibernate zip file into my Java folder, and inside this zip file you have the hibernate 3.jar, which we need for using the Hibernate library. And along with this hibernate 3.jar, there's also this lib folder. The lib folder contains the jars that Hibernate requires. So since we're using Hibernate, we also have to include the dependencies of Hibernate. So the jars that we need essentially are the ones in this required folder, and we need this JPA jar. I'll talk about what JPA is later, but know that this required folder and the JPA, these contain the jars that we need to include along with this hibernate 3.jar. This is the main jar which has all the binaries for Hibernate. Now let's open up Eclipse and start a new project. Okay, I have Eclipse open here. I'll right click, new project. I'll select Java project. We'll call this first Hibernate project. I'll leave everything else as a defaults, and I'll say finish. Perspective, no, that's okay. I want to leave the perspective as it is. Now, first thing I need to do here is to include the jar files in the class path, the ones that we have downloaded from the Hibernate website. So in order to do that, I go to properties and the Java build path, the libraries tab. So I need to create a new library and add it. I'll be creating a library because we'll be writing a lot of code with Hibernate, and it's handy if we have a library with all the required jars bundled in it, so that we don't have to worry about adding the jars each and every time. We just add the library. So I'll say add library, and I'll select user library. Now I do not have any user libraries, so I'll say new. I'll call this Hibernate. Here, make sure that you don't select the system library checkbox here. It should be a user library alone. Now I have the Hibernate library. Now I need to add the jars. The way to do that is to click on the add jars and go to our Hibernate distribution. The main jar is the hibernate 3.jar, so I will add that first. Okay, that's done. Next, what I'll do is I'll go to the lib folder, and the ones in the required, all these are the mandatory dependencies of Hibernate that we'll have to add. So I'll add all of them. Then again, add jars. In the lib, there is this folder called JPA. There will be one jar inside this JPA folder. This one we need to add. We'll understand what JPA is a bit later. And then finally, inside the lib folder itself, there is a folder called bytecode. So I will use the Java assist. We need to add one of these two. I will choose the Java assist here. And again, this is something that we'll look at later as to why we are adding that jar. So now we have the Hibernate library set. So I press OK. I choose this library to add to the class path. Now I have Hibernate here with all the required jars. Let me expand this. You can probably pause this video and check to make sure that you have all the jars in your Eclipse library. Now before we start writing code here, there is another step that we need to do, which is installing the database, which is obvious. We have Hibernate here, which connects to databases, and we are working with databases, so So we need to have a database in our development environment so that we can configure Hibernate to connect to this database. Uh, there are a lot of free databases available. I don't want to talk about the steps involved in installing a database, because in that case I would have to pick one, and I don't want to enforce a particular choice of a database to the people who are following this tutorial. I happen to have Postgres DB installed in my machine, so I'll be using Postgres in the examples here, but this is not really necessary. You can have any database available, and you can configure Hibernate to connect to that database. But when it comes to these examples in this tutorial, I'll be using Postgres database. If you want to follow along and install Postgres database, you can go to the Postgres website. You can just do a Google search for Postgres, and you'll be directed to the download section where you can download and install for free. My Postgres installer also came with this GUI tool that I can use to connect to the database. I have set the password as password here, but yeah, it's a database that's set up by default. I can create databases, I can run queries and all those things using this GUI tool. This will also be handy. But then again, this is just a choice that I've made because I have used Postgres before. You're free to install any database of your liking, and you can follow along these tutorials equally fine. However, depending on the database that you choose, you will have to download the JDBC drivers for that database. So what's happening here is that while Hibernate provides a layer of abstraction when it comes to the database connections, Hibernate internally is using JDBC to connect to the database. And depending on what database that we are using or we are configuring Hibernate to connect to, we will have to supply Hibernate with that JDBC driver so that it can use that driver to connect to the database. So since I'm using Postgres here, I will need the Postgres JDBC driver. If you're using another database, you can download the JDBC driver for that. If you don't know how to download the driver, just doing a Google search for the driver should help. For example, Postgres JDBC driver gives me the direct link. I will download the type 4 driver here so that I just have to add the jar file and we are done. So I have actually downloaded the driver here already. All I need to do is add the jar to the build path again. So I go to the libraries here and I say add external jar, and in my Java folder I've downloaded this JDBC driver, so I just add this jar and say OK. Now this will help the Hibernate library to connect to our database. Say you want to change the Hibernate configuration to another database, you will have to do two things. First thing, of course, to install the database on a particular machine, and then the second thing is to provide the the required JDBC driver for that database. We need to provide that to Hibernate so that Hibernate can connect to that database. So these are the steps that we need to do in order to create a project and use Hibernate. So this we are done here. We have what we have done is we have downloaded the Hibernate binaries and we have added a library into our project, and we have also downloaded the JDBC driver for our database and we have added that to the project. What I did not cover in the tutorial is actually installing the database. You can pick a database of your choice and install it, and supply the corresponding driver to Hibernate by just adding that JDBC jar into your Eclipse project's build path.